Sarah is now in the grave. She's gone. Isaac is now married and starting his own family. And so now we come into the beginning, if you will, of Isaac's family. And he's going to have a little bit of troubles at first. But we begin with verse 1, where Abraham took a wife, of course, after Sarah had died and now is in the grave. He took a wife. Her name was Keturah, and she bore him Zimran, Yokshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan begot Sheba and Dedan, and the sons of Dedan were Ashuram, Letushim, I would say, and Leomim. This is actually an exercise in names, non-English names. So we're going through them rather quickly on purpose. So Abraham has more kids. God already told him, you're going to be the father of many nations. And all of these people are going to go off and have families that are going to grow and grow and grow. And they're all going to be different nations that are going to be around the nation of Israel at some point and become a force or an influence in the world in no time at all. Well, the sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abidah, and Eldah. All these were the children of Keturah. And Abraham gave all that he had to Isaac, but Abraham gave gifts to the sons of the concubines which Abraham had, and while he was still living, he sent them eastward, away from Isaac his son, to the country of the east. So here Abraham gave all that he had, and he was wealthy, you'll remember. He gave it all to Isaac, and of course the reason was that Isaac was the son of promise, and he was the only son of promise. So in essence, by Abraham giving everything that he had to Isaac, he was trusting the word of the Lord. God told him that through Isaac shall the world be blessed. Through Isaac shall your generations be blessed. And so this was the son of promise. And God is going to continue his promise and covenant, the Abrahamic covenant with Isaac, and it's going to continue through him. And all that we're going to talk about with the brothers and everything else that are going to come, Isaac's sons, it's all about the Messiah and who is going to inherit the honor, the privilege of Messiah. This is where this is actually going. So Abraham gave everything he had to Isaac, but he blessed his other sons, and he blessed them with gifts. Nothing of great wealth, but enough probably. He was wealthy enough. And then the blessing, he sent them away. This is the land of promise. It belongs to Isaac. The rest of you guys got to get out. That's kind of how it was. And it wasn't, I know it sounds callous, it sounds rude, it sounds harsh, but this was God's plan. And honestly, Abraham doing it like this was actually the evidence of his faith. And so he's asked his other sons to go elsewhere because the promised land was only for the promised man, the promised son, and that is Isaac. This, he says in verse 7, is the sum of the years of Abraham's life, which he lived 175 years. That was his age. Then Abram breathed his last, died in a good old age, and an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. An interesting phrase. I like that phrase. The way I've explained it before is that they put the deceased person in a grave. As you know, over time, the body decays, and what are left are the bones, the skeleton of the body. And then they take the skeleton and gather them with the other deceased family members, and they sort of go into a pile, and the bones remain in one place altogether. And that way they can reuse the tombs that are there, and they're able to use it. And that's often what it means when it says gathered to his people. He was gathered to his people. They take the bones and put them all together with his family. His sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave of Machpelah, which is before Mamre, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite. This is the field which Abraham purchased from the sons of Heth. There Abraham was buried, and Sarah his wife. You'll remember that a couple of chapters ago, chapter 23, when Sarah died. The chapter starts off with Sarah dying, and Abraham had nothing, and so he went to buy a place where he was able to bury his dead. And so now the two of them are in there. It came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac dwelt at Beer Lahai Roi. So a well, Beer Lahai Roi was a well that they had dedicated to the Lord. Isaac was one who often dedicated wells. That was his way. And you're going to see he's pretty good at well digging. He should have started a business, actually. But God blessed him. And now we come to this part of the genealogy of Ishmael. The genealogy of Ishmael is important because of the promise that God made to Abraham regarding Ishmael. Remember, Abraham said, yeah, but what about my son Ishmael? What about him? And God said, oh, don't worry about him. I'm going to make him great also. He's going to be a father of many nations in his own right. So you don't worry about him. Send him away. Isaac is the one that I'm going to bless. He's been chosen, if you will, for the Messiah. Now, in verse 12, this is the genealogy of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's maidservant, bore to Abraham. And these were the names of the sons of Ishmael by their names, according to their generations. The firstborn of Ishmael. Now, I'm going to skip the names, and we'll go to verse 16. These were the sons of Ishmael, and these were their names by their towns and their settlements, 12 princes according to their nations. So here we find that he's going to have 12 princes, and ultimately 12 nations will come just from Ishmael alone. Now we know that Isaac now is going to have two sons, and the way the story goes, Jacob is going to have 12 sons of his own, and they're all going to go out and become actually one great nation to bless the nations of the world. So these were the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years, and he breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people. There's that saying again. They dwelt from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt as you go toward Assyria. He died in the presence of all his brethren, obviously his families and all. This is the genealogy of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as his wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian of Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Syrian. Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his plea, and Rebekah his wife conceived. So 20 years married, and they were unable to have children until Isaac interceded for his wife in prayer, prayed for her, and God heard their prayer. I'm sure she was praying too, and God heard their prayer. They gave birth, or they conceived. Now, the children, it says in verse 22, they struggled together within her, within the womb. And so she said, she's praying now, if all is well, why am I like this? So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, 2 peoples shall be separated from your body. One people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. So this becomes a prophetic word to Rebekah about these two children that were in her womb. She didn't understand what the struggle was. Obviously, no x-rays, no doctor. She didn't know what was going on, but there was a lot of activities in an unusual sort of a way. And so she was wondering. Then she asks God, Lord, what's going on? And God was kind enough to tell her, well, you have two nations in you, and they're at each other's throats. They're kind of always going to be at each other's throats. That's the nature of these two boys, what they're going to be, what they're going to grow up to become. And so you need to know that. But let me tell you what's going to happen. The older shall serve the younger. Now, here we have something, it's in a sense prophetic in one sense, in that God is revealing the future to her. Or is God actually saying what he is going to decide, or this is his determined will? This is what we call divine sovereignty. In other words, God chooses someone for a purpose. This, again, that purpose, as we know, is the privilege to bear the lineage of the Messiah. What God is saying here is I have chosen one of them to be that person or that family line, and the one I have chosen is the younger. The younger, or the older, shall serve the younger, or will be beneath him. Now, this is, I think, very important, and the Apostle Paul talks about it in Romans chapter 9, where he mentions it, where he discusses it, and I think it's appropriate to read it at this point. In Romans, in chapter 9, and verse 10, Paul writes, not only this, but when Rebekah also had conceived by one man, even by our father Isaac, for the children not yet being born, nor having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand, not of works, but of him who calls. It was said to her, the older shall serve the younger, for as it is written, Jacob I have loved, Esau I have hated. Oh, that's a difficult verse. We don't like that verse. It's actually a verse from the Old Testament. It's a verse that we're not actually a big fan of. It comes from Malachi, and it sounds like God is saying he actually hates someone, which is not necessarily what it's really saying. It's more like Jacob I have chosen, and Esau I have not. That's more the proper way to understand it. Here, Paul called it this election. In other words, according to election. Election is a word that may confuse some people. It's simply the calling of God upon their lives, so that the purpose of God can be fulfilled. And so some people actually tried to make this about salvation, as if God has chosen us for salvation. Well, as we know, he wants the whole world to be saved. So it's not that he has chosen certain people to be saved and he's chosen certain people to be damned. That's not how it works. He just selected, he's sent Jesus to die for the sins of the whole world, and those who respond to that call are the ones who receive then the salvation of God. Well, here in this passage back in Genesis 25, God is giving us his divine choice. I have chosen Jacob, the younger, not Esau, the older. Well, what are they? They're seconds apart. One is born and the other comes right after him. So, yet, nonetheless, the firstborn always had the rights that the secondborn does not have. And so, always that firstborn child was given a special privilege. But in this particular case, God says, I'm going to do something very different. Also, Romans chapter 9 tells us that it had nothing to do with whether they were good boys or bad boys. It had nothing to do with any of that. In fact, Paul makes it clear that they hadn't been born yet. They didn't do good or evil. They hadn't had a chance to do right or wrong. And so that wasn't anything at all about their works or their ability to do things right or wrong. It was all about God's sovereign will. God said, I want Jacob for this task, not Esau. Why? We don't know. You'll just have to ask God when we get into heaven, if you still care. But that's sort of the way it is. It's just the way God made his choice. God is God, and he can choose whatever he wants with what belongs to him. We call that sovereignty. God is sovereign. He is above us. We don't need to question him. We might want to ask him why, like we see Rebecca ask, why is this happening? Those are not bad questions, but we don't judge God as if he has done something wrong. It's often we don't understand what's going on in his mind that makes us a bit crazy sometimes, but that's okay. Well, that explains, I think, where we are in this passage as God is speaking to Rebecca of what his intentions are with her children. So when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in her womb, just like God had told her. And the first came out red, and he was hairy, like a garment all over. So they called his name Hairy. That's what Esau means. They called his name Esau, and it literally means a hairy person. So they named him Hairy. I don't know if it was a joke, but later on you'll see he stayed hairy his whole life. Afterward, his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel. Excuse me. So they called his name Jacob, Yaakov, which Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So 20 years later, they had these kids. Well, Jacob is a word the name actually means, some have called it in English, supplanter. A supplanter is one who actually overthrows. He grabbed the heel as if they were saying, oh, look, he's trying to take that birthright from his brother Esau. Look at that. Why, that little trickster, that scoundrel of a kid kind of a thing. I'm sure it was a term of endearment, but Jacob grew up into the shoes. But it was more or less someone who's trying to undermine whoever's in front of him and take his place. That's what a supplanter is, to supplant, to take someone's place or to substitute them. So that's what Jacob intended to do. That's what Jacob grew up to do. And so the boys grew. And Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field, but Jacob was a mild man dwelling in tents. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't like being thought of as a mild man. You ladies might want men to be mild, but you're barking up a wrong tree. Guys are not supposed to be mild. Having said that, it has nothing to do with the passage. Mild is a very bad word, bad translation, I should say. That's not what the word means. It can mean that, but that's absolutely not what it means. It's a word in the Greek, tam, T-A-M, tam, actually. But the word was used for Job in the very first chapter, where it called him blameless and upright. The word means upright and good or decent or moral. So it's an important word in its description. I don't know why it has. I have heard so many sermons and done so many studies, heard so many people give sermons about this, how Jacob was a milquetoast, or Jacob was a mama's boy, and Jacob was all of these, I guess we would call sissy stuff, But that's not at all what he was. He was actually, it means well-balanced. He was a well-balanced fellow who actually was able to do whatever he wanted to do, including cook. He can cook. So that's where he dwelt in the tents. He liked to cook. I would call that smart. If you were a man out in the field in that day, there was a lot of work to be done over there. So this, I think, tells us that Jacob was more upright than what he often gets credit for. But at the same time, I'll say that Jacob may have been upright in that he wanted to do right, but very often he yielded to the nature or the tendency of his flesh, and that's what often got him into trouble. Well, it says Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And that is, of course, where we get the idea that Jacob was the mama's boy, whereas Isaac was the beloved of the father. Or Esau, Esau was the beloved of Isaac. Well, you can take it however you want. They're just two different personalities. As you know, if you've had more than one child, you've had a couple of kids, they're all different. All of them have different personalities, different strengths, different weaknesses. Some may fit into your wheelhouse, meaning I like a kid who's tough, and mom would say, well, I like the gentleness of so-and-so, and I think that, and everyone's kind of got their favorite one to connect with. But of course, when it comes down to it, we love them all. We love all our kids. There are some that you might feel a little closer to than others, and that's what we see here. You just want to be careful, I think, as parents, that we're not playing favorites. We don't want to do that. Well, Jacob cooked a stew, and Esau came in from the field, and he was weary. Esau said to Jacob, "Please feed me with that same red stew, for I am weary." Therefore, his name was called Edom. I think that's funny. We're going to call him Edom. We'll call him, Edom actually means red. We're going to call him Red because he likes red stew. It's sort of an odd sort of a thing. Edom, though, became significant later on as Esau would become the leader or the founder of the nation of Edom, which was to the southeast of Israel, just beneath the mountains of Moab, the Moabites. Edom became the home of the Edomites, and all because of Esau's family. He's going to become great in his own right, but he becomes this great leader over them. Jacob said, Esau asks for some stew, some lentil stew, and Jacob said, well, sell me your birthright as of this day. Right now, you sell me your birthright. And Esau said, oh, well, I'm about to die, so what is that birthright to me? What good is it going to do me? Now, this was obviously a moment of foolish passion. He certainly wasn't going to die from hunger, not in that moment. That wasn't going to happen. He wasn't going to die from being tired, which really is why he was considered a foolish man for even agreeing to this thing and giving up something as precious and valuable as the birthright of a family. And so what happens is he just didn't respect it at all. And Jacob said, swear to me as of this day. So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. I wonder, because of what God had already said earlier in verse 23, that the older will serve the younger. So then our question would be, whose idea was this? Was it Jacob's idea, who said, sell me your birthright? Or was it God's idea and caused it to happen? It's sort of a mind twister a little bit. I don't know who would get the blame for this or who would get the credit for that, because it was God's prediction that the younger was going to be above the elder child. And so he sold his birthright to Jacob, and Jacob gave Esau bread and stew of lentils, and he ate and drank, arose, went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. It's like he didn't give it a second thought, which a way of putting it is that he disrespected the birthright. Now, Martin Luther is quoted as saying, when he's talking about this passage of Scripture and what happened, is that Jacob actually bought what was already his, but Esau sold what was not his to be able to sell, because God had already said it's not going to be his. Esau's just going to think it's his for a while. but it's not really his. So God had this whole thing in his plan, and later on you're going to see Esau is going to get over it, and he's not upset about it at all. Everyone's going to be happy, and God's plan just worked out perfectly. Again, it was God's choice that he called Jacob to this privileged position. Chapter 26, there was a famine in the land, besides the first famine that was in the days of Abraham, and Isaac went to Abimelech, king of the Philistines, in Gerar. Not again. This is like deja vu all over again. This is becoming crazy. That's exactly what Isaac's father did, you remember, twice. Well, the Lord appeared to Isaac and said, "Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land which I shall tell you." So you can go and look for food if you want because of the famine, but do not leave the promised land. You are to stay here in the promised land. So he says in verse 3, "Dwell in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For you and your descendants I give all these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father." So this is a reiteration of the promise that was given to Abraham. And remember, God said, through Isaac shall the promise be fulfilled. So here is God now personally giving the message to Isaac that this promise is extended to you. And so do as I tell you. Obey my word, and you will be blessed. That is a principle that cannot be taught enough. Obey God, and you will be blessed. We'll see that actually through this whole chapter. "And I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven." Sound familiar? "I will give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed." That is a messianic promise. That is about the Messiah. That's the only way all the nations of the earth will be blessed, is through salvation that comes through the Messiah, Jesus Christ. So here is this promise to Isaac that you're the chosen one, and your sons are going to give us the Messiah of the world. "And because Abraham obeyed my voice," notice this, verse 5, "because Abraham obeyed my voice, kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws." So this promise is accentuated because of Abraham's obedience. But notice what he says Abraham obeyed. He obeyed my voice. He obeyed my charge, my directions. He obeyed my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Those are the things that we use to mention the law of God. But the problem is we don't have the law of God yet. It hadn't been given. There was nothing written. There was no law. There was no written law. There was no religious Jews. There were no Jewish religion. None of that existed at this point. And so here is a man who made a life of walking with God. He made a life of his obedience to what God was revealing to him and doing. This is why Abraham's obedience was so important, and why it's important to the Christians. Excuse me, but he becomes the father even of the Christian faith in a sense, in that Abraham's obedience was even before the law or religion were created. He is a man with a heart for God. He loved God. He had this law written within his heart. In fact, I think of Paul's writing to Timothy as he writes this in verse 9 of chapter 1. He said, "Knowing this, the law is not made for a righteous person, but for the lawless and insubordinate, for the ungodly and for sinners, for the unholy and profane, for murderers of fathers and murderers of mothers, for manslayers, for fornicators, for sodomites, for kidnappers, for liars, for perjurers, and if there is any other thing that is contrary to sound doctrine, according to the glorious gospel of the blessed God, which was committed to my trust. Now, the law was made, the law of Moses, the Old Testament law, was delivered to keep people in line. This is the law. This is the line. Don't cross the line. If you do, the wages of crossing that line is sin. Abraham didn't have a law. He had a relationship with God. And in that relationship with God, he understood what God liked, what God hated. And so he always tried to stay close to where God liked his behavior, loved what he was doing. He wanted to love what God loved and hate what God hated. That's the man who didn't need law. That's what Paul was talking about in 1 Timothy chapter 1. So here is a man who just simply loved God. He loved God's commandments. He knew they were safe, and so he obeyed. Well, notice verse 6. So Isaac dwelt in Gerar, meaning he didn't go any further, or he obeyed just as the Lord asked him to, and he did like his father Abraham had done. And the men of the place asked about his wife, and he said, "Oh, she's my sister," for he was afraid to say, "She is my wife." So here we see the sins of the fathers sort of repeating themselves. And there are those who believe that, sins of the fathers shall be transferred to the children. And, there is a way of overcoming that, and the way of overcoming that is by obeying God. There are certain times when you have to step out of the shadow of your dad. If your dad was doing things the wrong way, if your dad was a wife beater, if your dad was a drunkard, if your dad was a molester, or your mom was that, or something, you step out of that by following the ways of God, the righteousness of Jesus Christ, and you no longer follow in the footsteps of evil, you follow in the footsteps of righteousness. So you may have, I suppose, reasons for behaving the way you behave, whether it's rude or bad or evil or immoral, whatever. You may have reasons by influence of your upbringing, but Jesus is the reason to change. He is the one who wants to help us to become new people. So we don't have to follow in the sins of our fathers. We can go beyond that. So here he says he was afraid, she's my wife, because he thought, lest the men of this place kill me for Rebekah, because she's so beautiful to behold. Well, it's very romantic, but of course he did foolishly. Now it came to pass, when he had been there a long time, that Abimelech, king of the Philistines, looked through the window and saw, and there was Isaac showing endearment to his wife. He was flirting with her, is what it's saying here. And Abimelech called Isaac and said, "Quite obviously she's your wife. How could you say she is my sister?" Isaac said to him, "Well, because I said, lest I die on account of her." And Abimelech said, "What is this you have done to us? One of the people might soon have lain with her, with your wife, and you would have brought guilt on us." This is amazing to me. Here's a pagan king. He's a pagan king. He's not afraid of the God of Israel. Not yet, anyway. He would become afraid. But he didn't fear God. He didn't understand moral rules as far as God is concerned. But yet, how odd it is that this pagan king understood that there were certain limits when it came to sexual sin, that there were certain limits when it came to the way he was to treat other men's wives. You just don't do that in his world, and he called it guilt would be heaped upon him. I think it's wonderful that there is this unwritten law that is in the universe, so to speak, that is the universe of men, I should say, that helps people to know right from wrong even without having it written down. And even our world knows it. They know what's right and what's wrong, but today, as you know, they're pushing the envelope as if to thumb their nose at God. They're going against what is natural in many ways. They're going against what is right. And Paul talks about it again to Timothy, and he says their conscience has been seared. In other words, they don't feel the guilt anymore. This pagan king felt the guilt. It would be wrong for me to sleep with your wife. He knew that, and he knew that God would hold them accountable even if they had done it ignorantly. And so there was this righteous mindset, even though they were pagan people, and I think God's people should never forget that. So Abimelech charged all his people, saying, "He who touches this man or his wife shall surely be put to death." So God protected her again because the man failed to do so. Then Isaac sowed in that land and reaped in the same year 100-fold, and the Lord blessed him. The man began to prosper and continued prospering until he became very prosperous. Well, why? Well, because he was living in obedience to the Lord. He did exactly what the Lord told him to do. Well, but the Lord didn't tell him to sow. No, he doesn't need to tell him to sow. The law of nature tells you to sow because you got to eat. You got to do what you got to do. You got to live life, but at the same time, while you're living life, you obey God, and the result of that is God will bless you. Maybe he'll bless you a little bit. Maybe the year after he'll bless you even more. Maybe the year after that even more. But he'll continue to bless you as you walk in obedience to his word, to his law, to his command. That's just common sense. Well, it's not always that easy, is it? Verse 14, Isaac had possessions of flocks and possessions of herds and a great number of servants, so much so that the Philistines envied him. Now, this is amazing. There are those who want the blessings of God, but they don't want to have to live for God. I just want to be blessed. I want to have all that the righteous people have, but I don't want to be righteous. I want to have all that God has for me, but I don't want to live for God. I just want to be my own person. I want to be my own man. Well, God says, well, I can't bless that. I'm not going to bless that. You go build your own kingdom if you want to. And many people do. They go out and they set up their own riches and their own wealth, their own kingdoms. They become wealthy, they become rich, and they forget about God. And eventually, either God helps them and they're able to see the Lord, or they die and all their wealth goes to someone else. But they don't get the blessing of God. This is a very important thing, that you shouldn't expect God's blessings if you're living for the flesh. Don't expect that. And some people will live like there is no God and then complain when God doesn't bless them. Well, it's really quite amazing. I do see it from time to time, even here in our church, that people just want the blessing of God, but they're not living for God, and yet they expect God should do something for them. Well, now the Philistines had stopped up all the wells. They were so envious that they wanted to do harm now to Isaac and his family. They stopped up all the wells which his father's servants had dug in the days of Abraham his father. They filled them with earth. Then Abimelech said to Isaac, "Go away from us, for you are much mightier than we are." Well, they began to fear Isaac instead of the God of Isaac. And so they started to kind of persecute him. And persecution is often a consequence in our lives when the blessings of God upon our lives become evident. But boy, it's worth it. Don't give it up. Don't give up obedience to God for anything, even if the persecution or the complainers might be great. Well, then Isaac departed from there and pitched his tent in the valley of Gerar and dwelt there. So he didn't fight. He didn't say, "Hey, this is my right. I dug this well. This was my father's place. I'm going to stay here." And I think there was wisdom in that. Isaac just moved on. It's possible in the back of his head, he's thinking, this is all my land. One day, I'm going to have my foot on your neck. One day, you're going to be evicted because God told me this is my land. I'll move for now, but I have a feeling you're not going to be happy with your future. But God spoke to Isaac that he's going to be the owner, the possessor of all this. You have to see the faith here in that Isaac didn't strive to grab this. He didn't have to strive for it because God had already promised it for him. So he dug again the wells. In verse 18, Isaac dug again the wells of water which they had dug in the days of Abraham his father, for the Philistines had stopped them up after the death of Abraham. He called them by the names which his father had called them. Now, again, a special little thing I see in here. In fact, here is wisdom. In fact, I'll say it's wisdom for the next generation to walk in the old ways, walk in the old paths. In fact, there's a passage in Jeremiah that I'll read to you from Jeremiah chapter 6 and verse 16. Thus says the Lord, stand in the ways and see, ask for the old paths where the good way is, and walk in it. Then you will find rest for your souls. But they said, we will not walk in it. So God is telling the people, these old ways that have been trusted by your forefathers and generations before you, they're good ways. Don't turn away from them. But the rebellious one said, nah, we don't want them. Here is wisdom. Walk in the old ways. Walk by faith and work hard. Dig the wells and dig deep. Don't be afraid to dig deep. Be afraid to look for shortcuts. That's often the problem with every next generation, not just your generation. My generation was the same way. My dad's generation was the same way. That when we look for shortcuts, especially in the spiritual life, we're cutting a corner that we would rather not cut eventually. Don't be afraid to stay on the old paths of truth. We're talking of truth here now, not just old-fashioned thinking. That's not what we're talking about. The old ways of righteous truth. Hang on to them. And don't think that you're going to reinvent anything. This truth is thousands of years old, and we don't grow tired of it. We hang on to it. So hold on to the old ways, the ways of God. He called them by names which his father had called them. He didn't have to reinvent anything. Just take what your dad gave you and use it for your spiritual strength. Also, Isaac's servants dug in the valley and found a well of running water there. Ooh, they scored. This is even a better well. It's living water. Running water is what living water is. It's fresh water. It's not just stagnant well water, as it were, but running water. Really, it's coming out. It's fresh all the time. But the herdsmen of Gerar quarreled with Isaac's herdsmen, saying, the water is ours. So he called the name of that well Esek, because they quarreled with him, the well meaning quarrel. And then they dug another well, and they quarreled over that one also. So they called the name of that one Strife, or contention, or Sitnah is the name here. And he moved from there and dug another well. Notice he just keeps moving. I'm not going to fight. I'll just, all right, take it. This is why he needed to really have a well business. He was successful at it. And he was able to dig, his servants were able to find the water and dig down and get the water. And he moved from there and dug another well. They did not quarrel over that well, so he called its name Rehoboth, which means spacious or roomy. For now the Lord has made room for us, and we shall be fruitful in the land. So all of these wells shows a side to Isaac that is more wise than one might think. He wasn't about to stand his ground, didn't need to stand his ground. He just moved on because all of it was his anyway. So he went up from there to Beersheba. Now Beersheba is actually the headquarters of Abraham. You'll remember in his latter years, he was there. And that became his home away from home, his hometown. It's where his dad lived for many years. It's where he met with God, and God made promises to him there. He planted that tamarisk tree there and worshiped the Lord and offered to the Lord there under that tree. Remember when we were in that chapter, I suggested that was like the first temple of the Abrahamic faith. That was his first temple where he called upon the Lord. Well, the Lord appeared to Isaac, it says in verse 24, that same night, and said, I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not fear, for I am with you. I will bless you, multiply your descendants for my servant Abraham's sake. I think it's sad, but in one sense, but it's comforting in another sense, how many of God's children or God's chosen servants struggle with fear unnecessarily. You don't have to be afraid, he says, but so often God's servants in the Bible have fear, and he has to show up to them and say, don't be afraid. How'd you know I was afraid? I could tell. Don't be afraid. You don't have to be afraid. He says, because I'm going to bless you, and I'm going to multiply your descendants, like for my servant's Abraham's sake. In other words, you don't worry about blowing it, because I've already made the promise it's going to happen, and you're going to blow it too, but I'm going to walk you through this. And so he built an altar there, called on the name of the Lord. He pitched his tent there, and there Isaac's servants dug a well. Then Abimelech came to him from Gerar with Ahuzath, one of his friends, and Phicol, the commander of his army. Now, Abimelech and Phicol were actually titles. Abimelech is the title for the king, and Phicol was like general, like the general of the army, the head of the army. Isaac said to them, and the reason I say this is because in Genesis chapter 21, we see those same names dealing with Abraham, the general, and the king. A different general, different king, but they were still there. Isaac said to them, why have you come to me, since you hate me and have sent me away from you? But they said, we have certainly seen that the Lord is with you. So we said, let there now be an oath between us, between you and us, and let us make a covenant with you. So they can't deny that God is with him. In fact, you remember Nicodemus? He came to Jesus at night and said pretty much the same thing. We can't deny that God is with you, for nobody can do the signs that you do unless he was. So God is with you. So he came to his senses with Jesus. These guys are coming to their senses. We're not going to fight this guy anymore. We're going to have to make peace because God is too powerful in them. And so that you do us no harm, since we have not touched you, since we have done nothing to you but good, and have sent you away in peace, you are now the blessed of the Lord. Yes, they finally admit it. So he made them a feast. That's grace there, kindness. And they ate and they drank. And then they arose early in the morning and swore an oath with one another. And Isaac sent them away, and they departed from him in peace. And this is always a benefit of full surrender. You notice how these guys came and ultimately kind of bowed themselves down. And this is what Paul said what they would do with Jesus. One day every knee is going to bow. Every knee is going to confess that Jesus is Lord. Ultimately, you have to see the reality of that. And that's what's happening. And the sooner we do that, the better we're going to be and the more blessed we will be. Well, it came to pass the same day that Isaac's servants came and told him about the well which they had dug, and said to him, we have found water. So they just keep finding water. Now, that's important. They didn't have Landis water and sewage. They didn't have that sort of thing out there. They didn't have a running tap somewhere. They had to dig for a well. They were desert people. They lived in the deserts, and so they constantly needed to go from well to well to well to well. So the more wells they had, the better they were in serving their flocks. So they had to have the wells. So they were very adept at finding them and digging them. So this was a banner day. We have peace and we have more water. And so he called it Sheba there Therefore, the name of the city is Beer-sheba, or well of Sheba, or well of the oath, or well of the seven. That's the name that Abraham gave it when he pulled out 7 lambs and made an agreement with Abimelech in those days. When Esau was 40 years old, he took as wives Judith, the daughter of Beri the Hittite, and Basemat, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, and they were a grief of mind to Isaac and Rebekah. You say, nothing's changed. Kids, they're a grief of mind sometimes. And this, of course, indicating to us how God had probably made a better choice. Esau was not seeking after the things of God. Ultimately, Jacob would become a man after God's heart, though he had to go through quite a bit of hoops to get there, as we will see as the chapters continue. So, with that, so much to go through, so much to learn, important stuff that helps shape our faith in this life, though we're studying the faith of a man in another life, in another culture, in another world. All of it, God says in the New Testament, is for our learning so that we would be blessed by it. So, Lord, bless us now. We read your word, we study it, we see the examples of these men of faith. And so help us to do the same, to take the wisdom from your word and then just live it. To live it no matter where we are, in the marketplace, in the workplace, in the play place, wherever we are. Help us to live in love with you under your blessed hand of mercy. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.